So the topic of anxiety and our search for peace is very personal for me because my wife, Rachel, for the first 5 years that we were married, struggled really badly with anxiety. It kind of clustered around her stuff about her health, and it would just kind of spring out of nowhere and suddenly turn a day at work or a normal social situation or even just a night's sleep into this horrible kind of battle that she had to fight with her own brain and her own body. It was really grim, and I'm really grateful that through a combination of different things, she's doing substantially better now. But I spent a lot of time thinking about these questions during those 5 years. And I became very aware of the kinds of solutions that people offer you if you're anxious or stressed. And we learn from experience that actually a lot of them, without meaning to be, are quite cruel. Our experience of Rachel's anxiety and my own experience of times where I've been intensely stressed is that, like Joyce actually mentioned at the start, a lot of it comes back to the question of control. To feel anxious or stressed is almost always to feel that you ought to be in control of something, that you need to be in control of something, but you're not in control of it. When I think about the most stressful situations I've ever been in at work, it's always been when I felt like I was responsible for things that actually I couldn't control. And when you boil it down, I think most of the advice that's out there about anxiety, and a lot of our own instinctive reaction too, is to say, okay, here's the solution: get more control. Get a tighter grip. That might be control of the situation. Often our default response to being stressed or anxious is just to try harder to get circumstances under control. We think, if I just work a bit harder, if I just plan a bit better, if I just worry a bit more, then I'll get a grip on all of this stuff and I won't have to worry about it anymore. Or it might be control over our own mind. Most of the whole massive industry of kind of self-help and stuff, whether it's a mug that says keep calm or books or TikTok gurus talking about mindfulness or even manifesting, it's all basically saying the answer to your stress and anxiety is for you to get a tighter grip on your own mind. Get a grip on how you think, get control over your mind, and you can stop your anxiety. And I think that for occasional stressful situations or for kind of mild worried thoughts, that can be really helpful advice. But I actually think that when things are more intense than that, this kind of advice can actually be cruel. It can make a bad situation worse. A while ago, I read this fascinating book by Sarah Wilson about her journey with anxiety. And she basically says she realized she was trying to treat her anxious overworking and overthinking by doing more anxious overworking and overthinking. She said doing this kind of thing actually made her more stressed, more scared, more exhausted because she was worrying about her worries. She was feeling guilty about her guilt. She was desperately fighting to get control of her urge to get everything under control. She was treating the problem as if it was going to be the solution. And that's basically the definition of an addiction. She was addicted to control. And so it ends up being a bit like that magical plant in Harry Potter, Devil's Snare. I don't know if you have seen it. But the more you struggle, the tighter it wraps itself around you. The more we fight to get control, the tighter the tendrils of anxiety and worry wrap around us, and the more suffocating it becomes. We are control addicts. We really want to be in control, but that urge actually is suffocating for us. There's a fascinating example of this in an episode from Jesus' life. It's such a spectacular story that 3 out of the 4 early biographies of Jesus that we have collected in the Bible have this story in them. Jesus and his group of close disciples are in a boat going across the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus is exhausted from a day of teaching crowds. And so he kind of curls up in a sheltered bit at the front of the boat on a cushion and goes to sleep. And then as they're going across, suddenly a fierce storm comes up. And the Sea of Galilee is notorious for these kinds of storms even to this day. The waves start crashing in over the side of the boat, and the disciples are there kind of bailing out as fast as they can, but they can't keep up. And one of them grabs Jesus, shakes him awake, and says, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" And Jesus stands up in the boat and just says, "Quiet, be still." And the wind drops. And the sea flattens, and they are safe. And these disciples are just staring open-mouthed at this flat sea all around them. And Jesus turns to them and says, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And the narrator says this: they were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." So here's what I find really fascinating about that account. If that was just a nice kind of fairy story type tale, you would think that the disciples would be scared before Jesus calmed the storm. Everything's wildly out of their control. But afterwards, they'd be amazed and happy and relieved, and they'd all say, "Wow, isn't it wonderful to have Jesus with us in the boat?" But that's not what Mark says in this account. He's got this fascinating detail where he says that after Jesus does the miracle, they are terrified. Why? He says because they're looking at Jesus and thinking, "Who is this?" He has just spoken to the wind and the waves, these wild forces of nature, like a head teacher giving instructions to two naughty school children, and they have obeyed him. And this isn't a one-off. Jesus walked around this world acting like he owned the place. He gave orders to forces of nature, to forces of evil, to all kinds of diseases, even to death itself. And those things obeyed him. The world responded like Jesus actually did own the place, like he had every right to tell the whole of creation what to do. So in this moment, they are looking at him and beginning to ask, "Who is this?" And to realize that he's no mere moral philosopher. He's not just a spiritual guru or a prophet. He is the creator God become a human being. He's the great author who spoke the whole cosmos into existence, stepping into the story as a human character. That is why his words have such authority. It's because he's the author. And they realize this person is in their boat right next to them. Now, why are they terrified by that? I think it's because they are just like us. They are control addicts. It's terrifying that they might be in the presence of someone who has the absolute right to be totally in control. The author who has effortless, obvious authority over the world he's made. Because they know that if that is true, then he has made them too. He's created each one of them as well, and he has effortless, obvious authority over their lives too. And like us, they find that terrifying. I think we all have this kind of God complex where we want to live in our own universe. We want to live by our own rules. We want to be in control and to have everyone orbiting around us, don't we? We don't want to live in someone else's universe. We don't want anyone else to have the right to be in control of anything that really matters to us. And I think that is a big part of why many of us, whether we're Christians or not, on some level have a real problem with the idea of God. We struggle with it because we're addicted to control, and God threatens that. Because if there is a God who made us, it's not just that he has the power to be in control of our world and our lives, it's that he actually has the right to be in control, and that is scary. But I want to suggest that that is also exactly what we need. So Sarah Wilson in this book, she's definitely not a Christian, and she's certainly not trying to persuade anybody to be interested in Christianity. But she concludes that what she needs, instead of fighting to get more and more control, is to learn to trust something bigger than herself. She says what she's really longing for deep down is for someone else to say, I've got this, so that she can finally rest. And there's an honesty there about how small we actually are. Barely anything that matters to us is ever going to be completely under our control. We're just not big enough for it. We're never going to have enough control to find peace through it. And so we need to take a different route entirely. And so her conclusion is that we need to trust something bigger than us. That if we can't find a way to trust, we can never find a way to rest. And that is where for me and Rachel and for Alison and Giacomo and for many other friends that I've spoken to over the years, Jesus is so compelling. Because he shows us a God who we can trust. He shows us a God who's so much bigger than us and so much bigger than everything we could ever be anxious about. The author of reality with the authority to just speak and calm a whole storm. The author of life who had the authority to lay down his life and then rise again from the dead to everlasting life. A God who's so much bigger than us, and at the same time, a God who really, really cares. I find it really striking that with the disciples, they wake Jesus up shouting, "Don't you care if we drown?" And Jesus' response is to say, "Do you still have no faith?" He's saying, "Don't you trust that I do care about you?" This is right at the heart of what it means to have faith for a Christian. We can trust Jesus because we know he really cares. In fact, we are in a much better position to trust Jesus and to know that he cares than those disciples were in that boat, because we know something that they didn't yet. They knew at that point that Jesus cared enough about them to wake up and to speak a few words to stop them from drowning. But we know now that he cares about us so much that he was willing to die to save us from ultimate death. That is the totally unique, crazy, beautiful thing about Jesus. He walks around acting and talking like he's the creator of the universe, but then he willingly hands himself over to be falsely condemned, tortured, stripped naked, and brutally executed. And he says that he's doing that for us. For our sake. He's dying our death for us so he can rescue us and invite us to share in his renewed resurrection life. That is how much he cares about us. And here's something I've always found really deeply helpful in the midst of anxiety and stress. The night before Jesus handed himself over, he was so scared, he was in such profound mental agony about what he was going to do, that he was actually sweating blood. So when we are anxious or terrified, we know Jesus gets it. And more than that, he gets it because he chose to. He chose to experience that for our sake. I mean, he had calmed a storm with a word. He could have stopped it happening so easily, but he didn't. He surrendered himself to be humiliated and killed for us. That is how much he cares. And because we know that he really, really cares, we can trust him. And if we learn to trust Jesus, then we can finally rest. We could admit that we are not in control, but trust him instead, and finally take that kind of deep breath and rest from our desperate attempt to be God. And what Rachel and I have found is that this makes a profound difference. It isn't a kind of magic wand or a kind of miracle 3-step cure where you just do this, this, and this, and then everything, you never feel anxiety ever again. It's a slow process for Jesus to try to sort of gently disentangle all the tendrils of stress and anxiety that have wrapped themselves around our bodies and our minds over many years. But Jesus has been an anchor that we can hold on to in the wildest storms. And his resurrection from the dead is this beacon of glorious, solid, unshakable hope that you can look to even when everything else around looks like darkness. And as time goes on, trusting that Jesus cares is a kind of path that we can walk along towards peace, knowing that Jesus is always right there walking with us. And that as we spend time with him, we learn to trust him more and more deeply. And the more we learn to trust him, the more we discover that we can finally rest. Thanks.